In the most carefully tended garden, it is said, the seeds of betrayal often sprout from the very hands of the gardener. They do not require sunlight, only the quiet shade of greed and the deep, silent soil of a love that has been misplaced. This is a truth that settles not in the mind, but in the bones, a cold recognition that sometimes the place you call home is simply the most beautifully decorated cage. Inside the hallowed, silent halls of the New York County Courthouse, this truth was the very air that Elara Vance breathed. She sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her gaze locked on the two people sitting opposite her. To any observer, they were simply the defendants, Richard and Eleanor Vance, a portrait of old money and offended dignity. But to Elara, they were the architects of her life and the authors of her heartbreak. They were her mother and father. Her mind drifted back, just for a moment, to the suffocating silence of a year ago in the grand living room that had always felt more like a museum than a home. The scent of polished wood and wilting lilies hung in the air, thick with unspoken ultimatums. A sheaf of legal documents sat on the mahogany table between them, its stark white pages a declaration of war. Her father's voice, a low rumble that had commanded boardrooms and broken spirits, was unnervingly calm. "Sign it, Elara. It is for the good of the family." Then came her mother's touch, a soft hand on her arm, as meticulously gentle as her manipulation. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, perfect, crystalline drops of poison. "Your brother needs this, my love. You are strong. You have your own career. Don't be the one to tear this family apart." And so, with a shattered heart and a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, Elara had signed away her birthright, relinquishing her legal claim to half of a vast family empire, all for the symbolic, insulting price of a single dollar. But the woman sitting in the courtroom today was not the same girl who had surrendered in that living room. The sorrow had not vanished. It had simply calcified, hardening into a cold, diamond, sharp resolve. The flicker of hurt in her eyes was gone, replaced by the steady, unblinking focus of a predator. Her parents looked at her now with a mixture of confusion and contempt, unable to understand how the lamb they had raised had returned as a lion. They thought this was about money. They believed she had come crawling back for scraps from their table. They were wrong. Elara Vance was not here to reclaim a fortune. She was here for an accounting, for the truth that they had buried under years of tradition and expectation. She was here to prove that the deepest betrayals are not inflicted by enemies, but by those who claim to love you the most, all while they are locking the door to your gilded cage. And she was here to burn that cage to the ground. To the world, the name Vance was not merely a name. It was a brand, a seal of enduring quality etched into the very skyline of New York City. Vance Holdings was an empire of steel and glass, of prime real estate and unshakable financial power, built from the ground up by the formidable William Vance, a patriarch of the old school. But the empire's public face was now his son, Richard, who, alongside his wife Eleanor, had polished the family name into something more than just wealthy. They had made it mythical. The Vances were a portrait of American aristocracy, a flawless composition of success, grace, and unbreakable unity. They were the family you read about in glossy magazines, their annual charity galas, the stuff of legend, their lives seemingly untouched by the messy, inconvenient struggles of ordinary people. But as with any portrait, the truth depends on your proximity. From a distance, it is a masterpiece of light and shadow. Up close, however, you begin to see the fine hairline cracks in the paint. The heart of this portrait, the gilded frame that held it all together, was the family's 5-story brownstone on the Upper East Side. It was less a home and more a monument to their own legacy. Every floor was a testament to Eleanor Vance's impeccable, yet suffocating taste. Italian marble floors gleamed under the light of antique crystal chandeliers. Walls were adorned with art that was chosen not for its beauty, but for its investment potential. The air itself seemed curated, carrying the faint, clean scent of lemon oil and money so old it had forgotten its own origins. For Elara, this house was the geography of her childhood, a place of profound contradiction. She knew the comforting creak of the third step on the grand staircase and the way the afternoon sun cast rainbows through the beveled glass of the library window. But she also knew its coldness, the way her laughter seemed to echo too loudly in the cavernous hallways, the unspoken rule that emotions were to be managed with the same discreet efficiency as the household staff. It was a perfect, beautiful, and profoundly lonely place to grow up. At the head of this pristine world sat Richard Vance. He was a man who wore his authority like one of his bespoke suits, perfectly tailored and exuding an aura of quiet power. He did not inherit his father's vision, but he had a ferocious talent for maintaining it. To Richard, the world was a balance sheet. His company, his reputation, and even his family were assets to be managed and protected. He loved his children, of that Elara had no doubt, but it was a transactional love, an investment that was expected to yield specific returns. The primary return he sought was continuity, the seamless transfer of the Vance name and empire to the next generation. A generation that, in his mind, had only one viable heir. His wife, Eleanor, was the silent partner in this vision, the true artist behind the family's flawless facade. Where Richard was the stoic chairman, Eleanor was the brilliant CEO of their social and domestic lives. She moved through the world with a serene grace that concealed a will of iron. Her approval was a currency more valuable than gold in their social circle, and her disappointment, delivered with a placid smile and a softly spoken word, could dismantle a person's confidence with surgical precision. She managed her children with the same meticulous care she gave her famous rose garden, pruning and shaping them to fit the perfect image she desired. And in her garden, one flower was destined for the center display, while the other was merely complementary foliage. That favored flower was Leo. 2 years younger than Elara, Leo Vance was the living embodiment of his parents' ambitions. Handsome, effortlessly charming, and blessed with the easy confidence of a man who has never been denied anything, he was the designated crown prince of the Vance dynasty. He had drifted through a prestigious business school, his path smoothed by generous donations, and now held a vaguely defined executive title at Vance Holdings. He pursued a series of ventures, from launching a boutique record label to investing in a trendy new restaurant, each one a fashionable and expensive hobby funded by their father's endless patience. Leo wasn't malicious, not in the active sense. He was simply weak, a product of a life without consequence, and he had absorbed his parents' worldview as his own. He loved his sister, but in the way one loves a permanent, reliable feature of the landscape, assuming she would always be there, in the background, supportive and secondary to his own starring role. And then there was Elara, the brilliant anomaly. While her family curated a legacy, Elara built one. She was a gifted architect, a creator in a family of custodians. Her world, a bustling downtown studio filled with blueprints, models, and the chaotic energy of creation, was the antithesis of the sterile perfection of her family home. She dealt in concrete, steel, and light, intangible structures that served a purpose. She had made a name for herself on her own terms, winning awards for her innovative and sustainable designs. She was respected, admired, and successful in a way that was entirely her own. Yet, within the walls of the Vance family, her accomplishments were treated as charming little hobbies. They were acknowledged with a polite, slightly dismissive pride, the way one might praise a child's impressive drawing before sticking it on the refrigerator and promptly forgetting about it. This dynamic was never more apparent than during their mandatory Sunday dinners. These were not meals, they were performances. The long, polished dining table would be set with ancestral silverware and the finest china. The conversation, expertly steered by Eleanor, would glide over a predictable landscape of safe topics. Richard's latest business triumph, the upcoming charity auction Eleanor was chairing, and, always, Leo's polo match, Leo's trip to Aspen, Leo's brilliant idea for a new app that would, in his words, revolutionize the hospitality industry. Elara would sit there, a silent spectator in the theater of her own family. She would try to contribute, to share a story about a breakthrough in a difficult project or a new commission she had won. Her parents would listen with performative interest, their eyes glazed over, waiting for a polite moment to interrupt. "That's lovely, dear," her father would say, before turning his full, undivided attention back to his son. "Now, Leo, tell me again about the site you're considering for that new club." In those moments, Alara would feel the full weight of her otherness. She was loved, yes, but she was not valued. She was a part of the family portrait, but she was perpetually out of focus, blurred at the edges to ensure the central figures remained sharp and clear. For years, she had accepted this role. She had swallowed her disappointment, quieted her ambitions, and always stepped aside for the greater good of the family. She would smile, her practiced, placid smile, a beautiful, expertly crafted mask that concealed the slow, crushing erosion of her spirit. It was the smile of a perfect daughter. It was the smile of a willing prisoner. And it was this very facade, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, that would soon be brought crashing to the ground. The fall of a great patriarch is like the felling of an ancient oak. For years it has dominated the landscape, its shadow dictating where other things could and could not grow. Its death leaves a sudden, shocking void in the sky. And for the first time, the sun shines on ground that has long been in darkness. The death of William Vance, at the age of 92, was just such an event. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, a quiet end to a life lived at maximum volume. For the city, it was the end of an era. For the Vance family, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Alara felt his loss not as a gaping wound, but as a deep, internal silence. William had not been a doting, affectionate grandfather in the traditional sense. He was a creature of industry and intellect, a man who showed his love not through hugs, but through challenges. He was the one who, when she was a child, had spread the original blueprints of the Vance Tower on the floor and taught her to see the building not as a structure, but as a story. He'd given her complex puzzles to solve, listened with rare, focused attention when she spoke of her designs, and once, in a moment of quiet confidence, had told her something she never forgot. "You have a builder's mind, Alara," he'd said, his voice raspy with age. "Your father has a banker's mind. He knows how to count the bricks, but you know how they fit together. Never forget the difference." In his eyes, she was not just a granddaughter, she was a peer. He was her ally, and now he was gone. The official reading of the will was scheduled a week after the funeral. It was to take place at the downtown offices of Abernathy, Cole & Swain, a law firm so old its leather chairs seemed to groan with the weight of a century of secrets. Alara arrived alone, a solitary figure, in a simple, elegant black dress. A few moments later, her family entered as a united front, a somber tableau of grief. Richard was the picture of stoic control, though a subtle twitch in his jaw betrayed his impatience. Eleanor, veiled and graceful, moved as if through a dream, her sorrow a beautifully crafted performance for an unseen audience. And Leo, restless and uncomfortable in his funereal suit, wore an expression of strained solemnity, though his eyes darted around the room, eager for the proceedings to begin and for his destiny to be formally anointed. They sat together, a tight, exclusionary unit, leaving a conspicuous space between themselves and Alara. Her grief was private and real. Theirs felt public and strategic. She had no expectations. She had her career, her independence. The empire, she had always known, was destined for Leo. She was only here to bear witness to the final, formal passing of the torch. Mr. Abernathy, a man who seemed as ancient and permanent as the mahogany desk he sat behind, cleared his throat. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the suffocatingly quiet room. He was William's oldest friend and most trusted advisor, and his expression was completely unreadable. He began to read in a dry, steady monotone, starting with the smaller bequests. Donations were made to William's preferred charities, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the New York Philharmonic. Sentimental items were left to old friends and distant relatives. A generous trust was established for the long-serving household staff. It was all predictable, the standard housekeeping of a wealthy man's final affairs. Richard glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. Leo shifted in his seat. The preamble felt interminable. They were waiting for the main event, the pronouncement that would affirm the world as they had always known it. "And now," Mr. Abernathy said, his eyes lifting from the page for a moment to scan the faces before him, "we come to the matter of William Vance's controlling interest in Vance Holdings." A collective stillness fell over the room. This was it. The lawyer put on a pair of reading glasses and continued, his voice now carrying a different weight. "I will read directly from a preamble Mr. Vance wrote himself. My company," he began, "is more than an asset on a balance sheet. It is a living entity, built not just of steel and concrete, but of vision and integrity. A legacy of this magnitude requires two things to survive: stability and innovation. It needs a name that inspires confidence in the market, but it also needs a mind that can see the future. It needs a prince, but it also needs an architect." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Her father's face remained a stony mask, but a flicker of unease appeared in his eyes. Abernathy took a deliberate breath before reading the decisive clause. "Therefore, it is my final and binding decree that I bequeath my entire controlling interest in Vance Holdings, to be divided into two equal, indivisible, and co-regent shares of 50% to my two beloved grandchildren, Ilara Ann Vance and Leo Richard Vance." Silence. It was not a peaceful silence, but a violent one, a deafening vacuum created by the sudden implosion of a lifetime of expectation. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. It was as if Abernathy's words had frozen the very air in the room. Then, slowly, the tableau shattered. Richard Vance's stoicism finally broke. His face, which had been a carefully controlled mask, contorted into an expression of raw, unfiltered disbelief. He stared at Abernathy as if the old lawyer had just uttered a blasphemy. Beside him, Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, her gloved hand flying to her mouth, her perfect composure dissolving into shock. But the most visceral reaction came from Leo. The color drained from his face, replaced by a dark, mottled flush of rage. His mouth opened and closed silently. He looked at his father, then at his mother, his expression that of a betrayed child, utterly incapable of processing a world that did not revolve around him. And Ilara was thunderstruck. She felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. It wasn't the money or the power. It was the breathtaking, stunning validation. Her grandfather had seen her. All those years, she had felt invisible. He had been watching, and he had believed in her. It was a gift so profound it was terrifying. A crown she had never expected to wear, and its weight was immense. She felt a sudden, dizzying mix of gratitude, grief, and a rising sense of dread as she looked at the faces of her family. She saw no shared joy, no congratulations. She saw only shock, resentment, and the cold, hard glint of betrayal. As if to seal their fate, Mr. Abernathy delivered the final, brilliant stroke of William's design. "Mr. Vance has added a final stipulation," he said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "The shares are co-regent and cannot be separated. The company must be led jointly. Should one heir wish to sell or relinquish their share, they cannot do so to the other. Furthermore, any major strategic decision requires the unanimous agreement of both partners." It was a masterfully crafted cage, forcing them together, preventing Richard from simply buying or bullying Ilara out of her position. William had not just given her a gift, he had given her armor. The meeting was concluded. Richard rose stiffly from his chair, his movements robotic. Eleanor followed, refusing to meet Ilara's eyes. Leo shot his sister a look of pure venom before storming out of the room. They walked out of the law office, not as a family, but as three separate, hostile entities. The perfect portrait was irrevocably cracked. The war had begun. The short, silent car ride home from the lawyer's office was the beginning of the new Cold War. The air inside the Bentley, usually a cocoon of quiet luxury, was now thick with a hostility so dense it felt difficult to breathe. No one spoke. Richard stared out the window, his jaw a knot of granite. Eleanor dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Leo sat slumped, radiating a petulant fury. Ilara was the enemy, an insurgent who had appeared in their midst, and they had retreated to their respective corners to plot their strategy. The family home, once a place of familiar, if sterile, comfort, transformed overnight into hostile territory. The perfect facade remained, a testament to Eleanor's unshakable discipline, but it was now a brittle, transparent thing. Smiles were tight, politeness was weaponized, and every conversation was a minefield of subtext. Alara felt like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. A foreign dignitary from a hostile nation, her every move monitored, her every word analyzed for weakness. The campaign to bring her to heel did not begin with shouting. It began, as all effective sieges do, with a careful, methodical dismantling of her defenses. The first assault was led by her father. Richard summoned her to his study, the sanctum sanctorum of his power. It was a room designed to convey gravitas and intimidate visitors, paneled in dark mahogany and smelling of old leather and expensive scotch. He sat behind his enormous desk, a king on his throne, the portraits of his father and grandfather staring down from the walls like a silent jury. He didn't raise his voice. His tone was calm, measured, the sound of a man patiently explaining an undeniable truth to a child. "Alara," he began, steepling his fingers, "we need to talk about your grandfather's idealism." He let the word hang in the air, framing William's last wish as a sentimental folly. Vance Holdings is not a startup. It is not one of your modern, collaborative design firms. It is an institution, and institutions are built on tradition, on the orderly succession of power. For 3 generations, this company has passed from father to son. It is not a suggestion. It is the bedrock of our stability. Alara opened her mouth to speak, to invoke her grandfather's name, but Richard held up a hand. "I respect your talents. I truly do. You are a brilliant architect, but you design beautiful things. I protect an empire. They are not the same skill set. The market, our investors, our partners. They are conservative, Alara. They expect continuity. They expect a Vance at the helm, and that name, for better or worse, is carried by the son. Your involvement, as a co-regent, introduces a variable they will not understand and will not trust. It creates a narrative of instability. It invites challenge." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You will be, unintentionally, jeopardizing everything William and I have spent our lives building. You will be the crack in the foundation. Is that the legacy you want? To be the one who broke the chain, all because of a sentimental whim in an old man's will?" He presented his arguments as facts, as impersonal laws of the universe. He wasn't being sexist. He was being a pragmatist. He wasn't being a tyrant. He was being a steward. He made her feel that her claim was not one of right, but of reckless, naive emotion. She left the study feeling diminished, her convictions shaken, a seed of doubt planted in her mind. If Richard's attack was a precise, logical strike at her mind, Eleanor's was a full-frontal emotional assault on her heart. She cornered Alara a day later, not in the formal study, but in the sunroom, a place filled with flowers and memories of happier, simpler times. Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of beautifully tragic sorrow. She clutched Alara's hands, her touch both frail and binding. "We need to talk about your brother," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You see him as strong, as privileged, but you don't see how fragile he is underneath it all. This has broken him, Alara. He feels that his own grandfather, the man he idolized, deemed him insufficient. His entire life has been a preparation for a role you now want to share. You are not just taking half a company, you are taking half of his identity." She painted Leo not as the entitled prince he was, but as a wounded fawn, and Alara as the cruel hunter. Then came the tears, and with them, the guilt. "I have dedicated my entire life," Eleanor sobbed, "to keeping this family whole. I have mediated, I have soothed, I have sacrificed my own feelings 1,000 times for the sake of peace. And now you, my own daughter, for what? For a title? For money you have proven you do not need? You are willing to set this house on fire. You are forcing your father to choose. You are turning your brother into a stranger. You are driving a wedge so deep into this family that we may never recover." She squeezed Alara's hands tighter. "I have always been your champion. When you wanted to pursue architecture instead of a more suitable career, I fought your father for you. When you needed funding for your first studio, I made sure you had it. I have always been in your corner. Can you not do this one thing for me? For your mother? Step aside, Alara. Be the bigger person. Be the daughter I raised you to be." It was a masterful performance, a symphony of maternal love and weaponized guilt. Richard's arguments could be debated, but Eleanor's grief was a fortress. To argue against it felt like an act of cruelty. This was their strategy, a brutal pincer movement. Her father made her feel naive and unqualified. Her mother made her feel selfish and heartless. The campaign expanded. An aunt called, her voice dripping with concern, to say she'd heard Ilara was putting her parents through a terrible ordeal. A family friend pulled her aside at a charity luncheon, advising her to think of the family's reputation. Leo, meanwhile, adopted a policy of dramatic avoidance. If she entered a room, he would immediately leave, his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound injury. He was the victim, and she was his tormentor. The walls were closing in. Her friends, outside the rarefied air of the Vance dynasty, couldn't understand the pressure. "It's your inheritance. You're entitled to it," they'd say, and she appreciated their support, but they didn't understand. They didn't understand the crushing weight of a lifetime of conditioning, the ingrained instinctual need to be the good daughter, the peacemaker. The family she had loved was now a tribunal, and they had already pronounced her guilty. Her resolve began to crumble, worn down by the ceaseless, insidious drip of manipulation. She started to ask herself the questions they wanted her to ask. Are they right? Am I truly the one destroying everything? The siege was working. It was only a matter of time before the gates came crashing down. The siege had lasted for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of weaponized silence, of whispered condemnations, of pleading phone calls, and looks of deep, sorrowful disappointment. Ilara's spirit, once a fortress of resolve, had been worn down to rubble. She was exhausted. A bone-deep weariness had settled into her, the kind that sleep could not cure. She moved through her days in a fog, the arguments of her family a constant, looping echo in her mind. Her work, usually a sanctuary, now felt meaningless. What was the point of designing beautiful, harmonious spaces when her own life was a landscape of discord and ruin? She had stopped fighting back. Now, she just wanted the noise to stop. The summons, when it came, felt inevitable. It was Eleanor who called, her voice a fragile, hopeful birdsong. "Darling," she said, "your father and I, and Leo, we want to have a proper family dinner tonight. No more tension. Let's just sit down and talk everything through, like we used to. Please." Ilara knew with a chilling certainty that it was an ambush, but a small, traitorous part of her, the part that still remembered birthday parties and bedtime stories, clung to the lie. She was so tired of fighting. So she agreed to walk, one last time, into the lion's den, praying that she might find a family there instead. The den was perfectly staged. The dining room was lit by the soft, forgiving glow of candles. A magnificent roast sat on the sideboard, fragrant and untouched. But the atmosphere was not one of reconciliation. It was one of grim finality. This was not the Last Supper. It was a court-martial. Her father sat at the head of the table, her mother at the foot. Leo sat opposite her. They were a tribunal, and she was the accused. They did not even pretend to eat. As soon as she was seated, Richard folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and fixed her with a look devoid of any paternal warmth. "This situation has become untenable," he said, his voice flat and hard. "It has gone on long enough." He slid a leather-bound folder across the polished surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of her plate. "Our lawyers have drawn up the necessary documents. This ends tonight." The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. Ilara ignored the folder. She ignored her father. She looked at her brother, her last, desperate hope. "Leo," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "please, just listen. Grandfather wanted us to do this together. He believed in us. He believed our skills would complement each other. Think of what we could build. Your name, your charisma, my designs, my vision. We could take Vance Holdings into the future. We could do something he would be truly proud of." She was appealing to the boy she grew up with, the one she'd helped with his homework, the one whose secrets she had kept. She was searching his face for a flicker of that boy, a glimmer of kinship. For a moment, Leo just stared at her. Then, he glanced at his mother. Eleanor gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. Leo leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, a look of such condescending amusement that it made Elara's blood run cold. "Work together?" he scoffed, the word together dripping with ridicule. "Elara, be serious. You have a cute little company. You build glass boxes for hipsters and win little awards. It's adorable. We manage a multi-billion-dollar global real estate portfolio. They are not the same thing." He picked up a silver fork, examining it as if it were more interesting than her entire life's work. "Let's be honest with ourselves, shall we? Who paid for that fancy Ivy League education that allows you to have your vision? When you started your firm, who made the introductions that landed you your first big clients? Every single thing you have, every success, is a footnote in the story of this family. You didn't build anything on your own, Elara. You just decorated a room that we built for you." The words struck her with the physical force of a slap. But he wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes, for the first time, filled with a genuine, ugly resentment. Grandfather was 92 years old. He got sentimental. He started talking about legacies and stories instead of profit margins. He wasn't in his right mind. "You are not a builder. You are a girl with a hobby, a very expensive hobby that we have all been kind enough to indulge. I am the heir. That is my birthright. That has always been the plan. And frankly, I am sick and tired of you being so incredibly selfish about it. Just sign the papers and stop all this drama." It was a mortal wound. The cruelty from her parents had hurt, but this was a betrayal that eviscerated her soul. The brother she loved did not exist. In his place was a stranger, a weak, cruel boy parroting the poisonous beliefs his parents had fed him his entire life. The last ember of hope within her died, leaving nothing but cold, black ash. She was empty. Richard saw his moment. He moved in for the kill. "Here is the choice," he said, his voice like the click of a gun's hammer. "It is very simple. You sign these papers. You transfer your shares to your brother, as was always intended, and you will remain our daughter. We will move past this unfortunate episode. Or you refuse. And if you refuse, then you are no longer a Vance in any meaningful way. Your trust fund will be frozen by morning. My name, Elara, carries weight in this city. Every bank, every contractor, every zoning commissioner. I will personally make it my business to ensure that every door you try to open is slammed shut and bolted in your face. You think you built something on your own? I will show you what it truly means to be alone." The threat was absolute, delivered with the chilling calm of a man who knew he had already won. As if on cue, Eleanor added the final, theatrical touch, reaching across the table, her voice a pained whisper. "Don't make us do this, my love. Don't throw everything away. Just sign the papers. Let us please, please, be a family again. Be a family again." The lie was so audacious, so grotesque, that it was almost laughable. She looked at their three faces, illuminated by the candlelight. They were not a family. They were a corporation, and she was a failing asset being liquidated. The fight was gone. The energy to resist had evaporated. All she wanted was for the pain to end. And in that moment of total spiritual collapse, a desperate, illogical thought took root. Maybe if I give them this, maybe if I prove my loyalty, they will finally love me the way I need them to. It was the last prayer of a condemned soul. Without a word, she reached for the folder. She opened it to the last page, where a small yellow sticker indicated her signature line. She picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen that lay beside it. The room was silent, the only sound, the faint hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beating of her own broken heart. She put the nib to the paper. The scratch it made seemed to echo in the cavernous silence. Her signature, usually a bold, confident stroke, was a shaky, hesitant thing, the final testament of her surrender. The moment the pen lifted, the atmosphere in the room changed. The immense pressure didn't ease into warmth or relief. It simply vanished, replaced by a cold, sterile sense of completion. Richard gave a single, satisfied nod. Eleanor let out a long, theatrical sigh of a martyr whose suffering had ended. And Leo could not suppress a small, triumphant smile. Elara looked down at the ink drying on the page. She had not saved her family. She had just sold her soul to stay in it. And in the chilling silence that followed, she knew with absolute certainty that she had never been more alone in her entire life. The act of surrender, Ilara discovered, was not followed by peace. It was followed by a silence more deafening and more punishing than the preceding storm. In her most naive moments, she had imagined that her sacrifice would purchase a return to normalcy, perhaps a strained and wounded version of it, but normalcy nonetheless. She had believed that by giving them everything they wanted, she would be welcomed back into the family fold, a penitent daughter forgiven for her brief, misguided rebellion. The reality was far more brutal. Having served her purpose, she was now irrelevant. The family, having successfully extracted the asset they desired, simply discarded the empty vessel. It began with the phone calls. Her calls to her mother, once answered with feigned warmth, now went directly to voicemail. "I'm sorry. I'm terribly busy, darling," the perfectly modulated recording would say, a message that was never followed by a return call. An email to her father about a minor family matter was answered not by him, but by his executive assistant in a terse, dismissively professional tone. Leo, of course, had simply blocked her number. The true, undeniable confirmation of her exile came a week later. It was a Sunday, the traditional day of the Vance family dinner. She waited all afternoon for the call that never came. That evening, scrolling numbly through a society blog on her laptop, she saw it. A candid photo of her parents and Leo, smiling, laughing, leaving a trendy new restaurant in Soho. The caption read, "The Vance family, as tight-knit as ever, enjoying a quiet evening out." The world saw the perfect portrait, but Ilara saw the truth. They had not just removed her from the frame, they had burned the photograph and pretended she never existed. She was an outcast. She had given them her birthright, her power, and her dignity, and in return, they had given her oblivion. The pain of the betrayal began to curdle into something else, a vast, hollow emptiness that consumed everything. She fell into the gray, muffled world of a deep depression. Her work, once her passion and refuge, became an impossible chore. She would stare at blueprints for hours, unable to make the simplest decision. Her spacious, beautifully designed apartment, a testament to her success, began to feel like a luxurious tomb. Sleep was a stranger, and food tasted like ash. She was a ghost, haunted by the memory of a family that had willingly, surgically excised her from their lives. Weeks bled into one another in a monotonous haze of grief. One rainy afternoon, unable to bear the silence of her own apartment any longer, she found herself drawn to the few things she had kept from her grandfather's estate. After his death, her parents had overseen the liquidation of most of his personal effects, but she had quietly claimed a small crate of his books, his favorite fountain pen, and a silver-framed photograph of the two of them taken on the day she graduated from Yale. She needed to feel a connection to something that had been real, a love that hadn't been a transaction. She ran her fingers over the spines of the old, leather-bound books, smelling the familiar scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. She picked up a heavy volume of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a book William had quoted often. As she held it, her architect's sensitivity to form and balance detected a subtle imperfection. It was almost imperceptible, but the weight was distributed unevenly. Her curiosity, a faculty that had been dormant for weeks, flickered to life. She examined the book closely, running her fingers along the inside of the thick cover. There, under the marbled end paper, she felt a faint seam. With trembling fingers, she carefully pried it open and discovered a cleverly hidden, hollowed-out compartment. And inside, nestled in the void, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm in the stillness of her chest. The box was made of dark rosewood, and it felt warm and smooth in her hands. It was personal, something he would have touched and held many times. She lifted the small brass latch. Inside, resting on a bed of faded black velvet, lay two items: a single old-fashioned brass key, heavy and ornate, and a thick, cream-colored envelope. The envelope was sealed with the dark red wax of the Vance family signet, and on the front, written in her grandfather's familiar, strong, slanted script, was a single word: Ilara. This was a message from beyond the grave, a final conversation. Her hands shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper. The letter began, and the world fell away. My dearest Ilara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and your father has done exactly what I feared he would. The first sentence was a vindication so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She wasn't crazy. She hadn't imagined it. He had known. He had seen it coming. First, the letter continued. Let me say that I am sorry. I am sorry for the terrible burden my will has placed upon you. I knew it was a risk, leaving you to face your father's ambition and your mother's machinations alone. But I also knew that you were the only one in our family with the strength to bear it. Your father is a good man in many ways, but he is fatally blinded by the myth of lineage. He sees a crown, not a company. He sees a son, not a successor. And he has mistaken your kindness for weakness. This is a fatal error many powerful men make. They forget that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire, and your beautiful spirit has been walking through that fire for years. They will have taken everything from you by now. They will have made you feel small, selfish, and wrong. They will have used your love for the family as a weapon against you. Know this, Ilara. You are none of those things. You are the best of me. You are the builder, the one who sees not just what is, but what could be. That is why I have left you not a weapon, but a set of tools. This key opens a safe deposit box number 713 at the Sterling Trust Bank on 57th Street. Do not go to our family's bankers. This is a private arrangement. What you find inside is the truth. It is the original blueprint of our family, with all its strengths and all of its hidden, structural flaws. Justice, my dear girl, is not a thing that is given. It is a thing that must be built, piece by piece, from a solid foundation. And building a case for justice has always required a master architect. Consider this key your foundation stone. Build something true with it. Build something that will last. Ilara read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. But these were not the tears of a victim. They were the tears of a prisoner who has just been handed the key to her own cell. The hollow emptiness inside her, the gray fog of depression, was burned away by a sudden, surging wave of incandescent anger. A cold, clear, and powerful purpose began to crystallize in her heart. He had not abandoned her. He had armed her. He had not given her an inheritance to be stolen. He had given her a mission. The ghost that had haunted her apartment for weeks vanished. The architect had returned. She stood up, her movements now sharp and deliberate. She wiped the tears from her face, her expression transformed into a mask of cold resolve. She looked down at the heavy brass key sitting in the palm of her hand. It was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a promise. It was a plan. It was the first brick in the edifice of her reckoning. The ashes had settled, and a single, dangerous ember was beginning to glow. The morning after she found the key, the city of New York woke up to a different Ilara Vance. The fog of depression had lifted, burned away by the cold, clean light of purpose. She did not dress in the soft, somber colors of mourning. Instead, she chose a charcoal gray suit, with a cut as sharp as her newfound resolve. It was armor. Every button fastened, every seam aligned, was a small act of reclaiming the woman her family had tried to erase. Her destination was not a familiar one. The Sterling Trust Bank on 57th Street was the kind of institution that did not advertise. Its discreet brass plaque was the only sign of its existence, a bastion of old money and older secrets. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and quiet discretion. After presenting the key and her identification, a silent, severe-looking manager led her through a series of gates and finally into the vault. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. He used his master key, then stepped back, allowing her to insert her own. The sound of the lock disengaging was a loud, satisfying thud in the stillness. The safe deposit box was heavier than she expected. She carried it to a private viewing room, a small, sterile cubicle with a single chair and a table. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. There was no gold, no jewelry, no bearer bonds. It was better than that. It was an arsenal. Her grandfather, the meticulous architect of an empire, had been just as meticulous in documenting its potential ruin. The box was filled with perfectly organized manila folders, each one labeled in his decisive script. There were financial ledgers detailing private accounts Richard had hidden from his father. There was a thick bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon, chronicling years of correspondence between William and Richard. In them, William repeatedly expressed his profound disappointment in his son's handling of Leo, warning that coddling the boy would create a weak and entitled man, not a leader. But the heart of the collection, the item that made Alara's breath catch, was a small, black microcassette recorder and a shoebox filled with dozens of neatly labeled tapes. She took everything back to her apartment, transforming her sleek, minimalist living room into a war room. For 2 days, she did not sleep. She read every letter, analyzed every ledger, and listened to every single tape. It was an experience that was both heartbreaking and empowering. She heard her grandfather's voice, strong and vibrant in the early recordings, grow weaker in the later ones, but his mind remained a razor. He spoke of his pride in her, his belief that she was the true heir to his builder's spirit. And then she found the tapes from the last 6 months of his life. His voice was a frail whisper, but his words were a bombshell. "Eleanor spoke to me today," the crackling voice on the tape said. She suggested it was time for Alara to find a good husband, that her career was a charming distraction but not a legacy. She said, and I quote, "A woman's name on the charter would send the wrong message." Richard just sat there, nodding like a puppet. "They are already plotting to dismantle my wishes. They see my will not as my final word, but as an obstacle to be overcome." Then came the final tape, the one simply labeled, "Their Plan." Alara's hand trembled as she pressed play. It was her grandfather, his voice heavy with a sorrow that transcended the tinny speaker. He recounted, in excruciating detail, a conversation he had accidentally overheard between Richard and Eleanor, who believed him to be asleep in his study. They spoke not of their daughter, but of a problem to be managed. They mapped out the entire strategy they would later deploy against her. Richard would handle the logic of tradition and business, while Eleanor would handle the emotion of guilt and family unity. They discussed the threat of cutting her off, both financially and professionally. "She will break," she heard her grandfather quote her mother as saying. "She loves us too much not to." Listening to the tape was like watching her own execution being planned by her executioners. It was premeditated, it was cruel, and it was all the evidence she needed. The rage that filled her was pure and cold. She knew she had a case, but she also knew she could not fight the Vance legal machine with a second-rate lawyer. She needed her own champion, an architect of justice. Her research led her to one name, Arthur Chen. Chen was not a household name, but in the legal world, he was a giant killer, a brilliant litigator with a reputation for taking on complex, high-stakes civil cases and winning them through relentless preparation and psychological acuity. His office was not the sprawling, panoramic suite of a corporate lawyer. It was a smart, efficient, book-lined space in a less ostentatious building, the office of a man who cared more about the work than the view. Arthur Chen himself was in his early 40s, with a calm, watchful stillness that was more intimidating than any display of aggression. He listened to Alara's story without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers, absorbing every detail. She laid out the narrative calmly, logically, presenting the facts as she now knew them. She spoke not as a wounded daughter seeking revenge, but as a client outlining a profound breach of trust. When she finished, she placed the microcassette recorder on his desk and played the tape labeled Their Plan. As her parents' voices filled the quiet office, detailing their conspiracy, she saw the first flicker of something in Arthur Chen's calm demeanor. The focused, a predatory interest of a master strategist who has just been shown the enemy's battle plans. When the tape ended, he was silent for a full minute. "They didn't just coerce you into signing a contract, Miss Vance," he said finally, his voice quiet but resonant. "They used their emotional and financial authority as your parents to commit an act of profound and deliberate bad faith. This isn't just about undue influence. It's about a fundamental betrayal of a fiduciary duty that is older than any law on the books. We will take this case." That was the beginning of their alliance. Alara and Arthur became a silent, formidable team. While the rest of the Vance family celebrated their victory, blissfully unaware, Alara was channeling her grief and rage into action. Her architect's mind, trained to see the intricate structures that hold things up, was now focused on deconstructing her family's lies. She created timelines, mapped out networks of influence, and built a visual schematic of the case that was as detailed and precise as any blueprint. Arthur and his small, dedicated team began the painstaking work of laying the foundation. They discreetly located and interviewed two former Vance Holdings executives who had been fiercely loyal to William and had been pushed out by Richard. They subpoenaed financial records and phone logs that corroborated every detail in William's vocal diary. They worked in the quiet, methodical way of builders, digging deep and ensuring every piece of the foundation was solid. The Vances believed they had concluded a successful and hostile takeover of their own family. They had no idea that their daughter was on the other side of the city, meticulously designing the legal equivalent of a controlled demolition. The war room was operational. The plans were drawn. The next step was to fire the first shot. For 3 weeks, the war room in Alara's apartment was a sanctuary of silent, focused preparation. Under the meticulous guidance of Arthur Chen, a mountain of evidence was collated, organized, and transformed into a legal argument as elegant and structurally sound as one of Alara's own buildings. The case was ready. The foundation had been laid. It was time to break ground. Alara felt a strange sense of calm, the serenity that comes after a great internal storm has passed. She was no longer a victim reacting to pain. She was a plaintiff taking deliberate, measured action. The first shot, Arthur explained, would not be a thunderous cannon blast, but the quiet, devastating arrival of a legal notice. It was a declaration of war delivered by a messenger who would have no idea of the inferno he was about to ignite. On a crisp, sunny Tuesday afternoon, the Vance family's perfectly curated world was proceeding as scheduled. Eleanor was in the drawing room, conferring with a florist about the centerpiece for an upcoming charity luncheon. Richard was in his study, closing a multi-million-dollar deal over the phone, his voice the familiar, confident baritone of a man in complete control of his universe. Leo was at his racket club, celebrating a victory with friends, basking in his new role as the undisputed heir to the Vance throne. They were safe, secure, and victorious. It was at that precise moment of tranquil self-satisfaction that the doorbell rang. The housekeeper opened the grand, imposing door to find a nondescript man in a rumpled suit. He asked for Richard and Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, annoyed at the interruption, came to the door herself, her expression one of polite dismissal for what she assumed was an uninvited salesman or a petition gatherer. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance?" the man asked, his tone flat and professional. "Yes," she replied, her voice clipped. The man extended a thick 9x12 envelope. "You have been served," he said, the words delivered with all the emotion of a weather report. Before Eleanor could fully process the statement, he had turned and walked away, disappearing back into the mundane reality of the city. For a moment, she just stood there, holding the heavy envelope. It felt cold, alien. With a furrow of her brow, she broke the seal, her mind still on floral arrangements and guest lists. She pulled out the thick sheaf of papers. The first page was stark, its heading in a severe, official font. Supreme Court of the State of New York, County of New York. Alara Ann Vance, plaintiff, versus Richard Vance and Eleanor Vance, defendants. The world stopped. The colors in the grand foyer seemed to drain away. The words swam before her eyes, nonsensical at first, then coalescing into a monstrous, unbelievable whole. Coercion, intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraudulent inducement, undue influence. Her breath came in a sharp, ragged gasp. A wave of ice-cold fury washed over her, so potent it made her hands tremble. This was not possible. This was not happening. She stormed through the house, the papers clutched in her fist, and burst into Richard's study without knocking. A breach of protocol that had not occurred in their 35 years of marriage. "She's suing us," Eleanor hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, throwing the documents onto his desk. Richard, a man who loathed being interrupted, looked up with a flash of irritation that quickly vanished as he saw the look on his wife's face. He ended his call abruptly and picked up the papers. He read them, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then hardening into a mask of pure glacial rage. Richard Vance was a man who prized control above all else. This document was not a lawsuit. It was an insurrection. It was a direct, public assault on his authority, his name, and his fundamental understanding of the world. In his mind, the actions he and Eleanor had taken were a necessary, if difficult, act of stewardship. They had corrected a flaw in his father's will. They had protected the family's legacy. They had acted as they always did, for the greater good of the Vance name. To see their parental guidance twisted into these ugly, legalistic accusations was, to him, the ultimate betrayal. This was not a disagreement. This was a declaration that he was a criminal and she was a victim, a narrative so grotesquely inverted that he could feel the blood pounding in his temples. When Leo arrived home an hour later, he walked into a war council. His parents, their faces pale with rage, presented him with the lawsuit. His reaction was one of sputtering, incredulous fury. "How dare she?" he exclaimed, pacing the expensive Persian rug. "After everything we've done for her, everything this family has given her? She's insane." In his mind, as in his parents', Alara was not a wronged party seeking justice. She was a saboteur, a greedy, ungrateful child attempting to steal what was rightfully his, what he had been promised his entire life. The three of them, who had been united in their conspiracy, were now fused together by a shared sense of righteous indignation. They were the victims. Alara was the villain. It was that simple. There was no thought of reconciliation, no moment of introspection. Richard immediately shifted into the mode he understood best: corporate warfare. He picked up the phone, not to call his daughter, but to call Marcus Thorne, the lead litigator at a law firm known for its scorched earth tactics and astronomical fees. Thorne was a legal shark, a man who saw the law not as a tool for justice, but as a weapon for total victory. Within hours, a preliminary meeting was held. Richard, Eleanor, and Leo presented their carefully crafted narrative to their new legal team. It was the story of a loving, generous family and their deeply troubled daughter. They hinted at emotional instability, at possible undue influence from outsiders, perhaps this new lawyer, this Arthur Chen. They were compelling, believable, the very picture of aggrieved parents forced into an unthinkable position. Thorne listened, his expression impassive, and when they were finished, his advice was swift and brutal. "This is a public relations battle as much as a legal one," he stated. "We have to define her before she has a chance to define you. We strike first, and we strike hard." The first shot in their counteroffensive was not fired in a courtroom. It was fired in the pages of the city's most influential society column. A day later, a small but devastating article appeared online, leaked as an exclusive from a source close to the family. It spoke of the unfortunate and painful private matter the Vances were enduring. It hinted at their daughter's recent erratic behavior following her grandfather's death and framed the lawsuit not as a legitimate claim, but as a desperate and misguided cry for help. The piece was a masterpiece of character assassination, painting Alara as unstable, greedy, and malicious, and her parents as heartbroken victims, concerned only for their daughter's well-being. Arthur Chen forwarded the article to Alara without comment. She read it, her stomach churning. She had expected a fight. She had expected them to deny her claims, but she had not expected this. They were not just fighting her in court. They were trying to destroy her in the court of public opinion. The private war had just gone public, and she was learning, with chilling clarity, that her family would stop at nothing to win. There was no longer any possibility of turning back. The Vances' public relations salvo hit its target with devastating precision. The story, carefully seeded in the fertile ground of New York's high society, exploded into a full-blown scandal. What began as a whisper in a society column became a roar in the city's tabloids and business journals. The name Vance, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now attached to a sordid, public family feud. For the city's elite, it was a spectator sport. At charity galas and exclusive dinner parties, the lawsuit was the topic of hushed, salacious conversation. Sides were chosen over cocktails and canapés. Most, naturally, sided with Richard and Eleanor. It was the safe bet, an alignment with the established nexus of power. They were the sun around which so many social and financial orbits revolved, and no one wanted to risk being cast into the cold darkness. For Ilara, this meant a sudden and brutal social isolation. The city she had always called home became a landscape of averted eyes and sudden silences. She would walk into a restaurant where she had been a regular for years, and a chill would descend upon the room. Friends of her mother, women who had known her since she was a child, would now offer only a tight, pitying smile before turning away. Her phone, once a constant stream of messages and invitations, grew quiet. The calls she did receive were from extended family members, distant cousins and great-aunts who had been thoroughly briefed by Eleanor. They didn't call to ask for her side of the story. They called to lecture her, their voices dripping with sanctimonious disapproval, about the sanctity of family, the importance of loyalty, and the shame she was bringing upon the venerable Vance name. Each conversation was a small, painful reminder that in the story her family was telling, she was the sole villain. But the Vances were not content with mere social ostracization. Their counterattack soon escalated from character assassination to a full-scale professional assault. Richard Vance's influence, a subtle and pervasive force in the city's commercial life, was now being weaponized against his own daughter. The first blow landed on a project that was meant to be the crowning achievement of Ilara's career to date, the design for a new contemporary arts center. She had won the commission over several larger, more established firms. The board had been effusive in their praise of her vision. The contracts were being drawn up. Then, she received a terse, formal email. The board had, regrettably, decided to reevaluate its options. There was no further explanation, but none was needed. The chairman of that board sat on 2 other charity committees with Eleanor Vance and played golf with Richard every third Thursday. The message was clear. Any business associated with Ilara Vance was now in opposition to Vance Holdings. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of the well. A contractor her firm had worked with for years suddenly pulled out of a project, citing a scheduling conflict she knew to be false. A promising young engineer she had been trying to hire, who had previously been enthusiastic, abruptly stopped returning her calls. It was an invisible siege, a war fought with quiet phone calls and implied threats, all designed to dismantle the one thing that was entirely hers. This was the attack that truly terrified her. The gossip she could endure, but this was an attempt to cripple her, to prove Leo's cruel words true, that she was nothing without the family's support network. For a few dark days, panic began to set in. She saw her life's work, the business she had poured her heart and soul into, beginning to fray at the edges. She was being erased, not just from her family, but from the professional world she had fought so hard to conquer. In a state of near despair, she went to Arthur Chen's office. The slanderous newspaper articles and contract cancellation letters spread across his conference table. "I have to fight back," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and fear. "I have to issue a statement, tell my side of the story. They are destroying me, and I am just sitting here in silence." Arthur listened patiently, his expression calm and steady amidst her storm. When she was finished, he leaned forward. "And that is exactly what they want you to do," he said, his voice even. "They are creating noise and chaos because they want to drag you into the mud with them." A public, messy fight between a powerful family and a hysterical daughter is a narrative that works for them. It creates doubt. It makes any legitimate claim you have seem like part of a dysfunctional family squabble. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city streets below. "Your silence," he continued, "is not weakness, Ilara. Right now, it is your most powerful weapon. They are screaming, and you are not. They are hiring PR firms and leaking stories, and you are quietly continuing to run your business. To the world, they are beginning to look frantic, desperate to control a narrative. You look dignified. You look confident. Every time you refuse to engage on their terms, you win. The courtroom is our arena. The evidence, presented under oath, will be our statement. It will be the only statement we need, because it will be the truth, and it will be irrefutable." His logic was a calming anchor in her sea of anxiety. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do, to absorb the blows without retaliating, to trust in a process that was agonizingly slow. But she agreed. She channeled her fury not into public statements, but into her work. She fought twice as hard for smaller contracts to keep her firm afloat. She gathered her small, loyal staff and was honest with them about the pressure they were under, inspiring a fierce sense of solidarity. She became a leader in a way she had never been before, protecting her professional family from the onslaught of her biological one. And slowly, subtly, the tide of opinion in the city began to shift. The Vances' ongoing, aggressive PR campaign started to feel like overkill to some observers. In a city that respected strength, Alara's stoicism began to look less like an admission of guilt and more like the quiet confidence of someone who knows they are holding a winning hand. The whispers at the cocktail parties began to change. "It's all a bit much, isn't it? The way they're trying to destroy her," some would say. "You have to admit, she's handling herself with an incredible amount of class." Alara was largely oblivious to this. Her world had shrunk to her office, her apartment, and Arthur Chen's conference room. One night, standing alone in her studio, looking over the blueprints for a small community library she had fought to win, she felt the profound weight of her isolation. She had been slandered, sabotaged, and disowned. But as she looked at the clean, elegant lines on the paper, she realized she was not broken. The public war had tested her to her limits, but it had also forged her resolve into something unbreakable. They had thrown their worst at her, and she was still standing. The first battle was over, and now she was ready for the war. The trial began on a cold, gray morning in October. The courtroom was a theater of hushed anticipation, packed with a curious audience of reporters, legal aficionados, and the cream of New York society, all drawn by the irresistible drama of a dynasty at war with itself. On one side sat the Vance phalanx, Richard, Eleanor, and Leo, flanked by a formidable team of 4 expensive lawyers from Marcus Thorne's firm, a wall of dark suits and grim confidence. On the other side sat Alara, and next to her, the calm, solitary figure of Arthur Chen. The visual was a stark David and Goliath tableau, a lone woman against the full might of the family empire. The air was thick with a tension that the judge's gavel could command, but not disperse. This was not just a legal proceeding, it was a public dissection of a family, and everyone had a scalpel ready. Arthur Chen's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled precision. He did not appeal to emotion. He spoke to the court as an architect presenting a blueprint. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady, "this is not a case about a family disagreement. It is a case about the systematic dismantling of a person's free will. We will demonstrate, through evidence and testimony, that the defendants engaged in a premeditated campaign of psychological coercion, using their positions of parental authority and financial power to force the plaintiff, their daughter, into signing away her legal and rightful inheritance. This was not a choice. It was a surrender under duress." He then began to build his case, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the methodical laying of a foundation, brick by evidentiary brick. He called to the stand a former executive of Vance Holdings, a man fiercely loyal to William, who testified that the patriarch had spoken often and enthusiastically of Alara's future leadership role. He followed with the family's long-serving housekeeper, who tearfully recounted the oppressive, hostile atmosphere of the house after the will reading, and the night she heard what she described as heartbroken sobbing coming from the dining room. Then came the moment that silenced the entire courtroom. Arthur moved to introduce into evidence the microcassette tapes from William Vance's audio diary. Marcus Thorne objected vehemently, calling it hearsay, but Arthur had laid the groundwork, and the judge, intrigued, allowed it. Arthur played a single, 30-second clip. The frail, crackling voice of William Vance, a ghost in the machine, filled the room. "They are plotting," the voice said, heavy with sorrow. "Richard and Eleanor. They believe Alara's share is a mistake to be corrected, not a wish to be honored. They speak of a plan to persuade her. I fear they will break her spirit to get what they want." The impact was profound. A dead man was testifying against his own son. When Alara took the stand, she was the embodiment of the quiet dignity she had cultivated for months. Under Arthur's gentle questioning, she recounted the events of those 2 terrible weeks. She spoke without melodrama, her voice low but steady, detailing her father's threats and her mother's manipulations with a chilling, factual clarity. She was not a hysterical daughter. She was a credible witness reporting a crime. Marcus Thorne's cross-examination was brutal. He was aggressive, condescending, and dismissive, attempting to paint her as an unstable, greedy woman scorned. "Isn't it true, Miss Vance, that this is simply a case of seller's remorse? You made a deal, and now you regret it." Alara met his gaze without flinching. "It's impossible to have remorse for a decision you were never truly free to make," she replied, her quiet words cutting through his bluster. Thorne pushed. He insinuated. He attacked. But she would not be rattled. Her composure was her shield and her testimony, her sword. Her parents, by contrast, were studies in polished indignation. Richard was arrogant and dismissive on the stand, treating Arthur Chen's questions as an annoying impertinence. Eleanor was the picture of a heartbroken mother, dabbing at her eyes and speaking of her deep concern for her daughter's fragile state. They denied everything. Their stories perfectly aligned, their performances flawless. They were so smooth, so consistent, that they seemed almost inhuman, their testimony a pre-rehearsed script from which they would not deviate. They were impenetrable. The weak link, as Arthur Chen knew, was Leo. When he took the stand, he exuded a breezy, entitled confidence. He was the charming, wronged heir, and this was his chance to put his selfish sister in her place. Under the friendly questioning of his own lawyer, he was smooth and convincing. But then, it was Arthur Chen's turn to cross-examine. Arthur began gently, asking about Leo's various ventures, his role at the company, making him feel comfortable, letting him puff out his chest. Then, he pivoted to the night of the signing. "Mr. Vance, you were deeply concerned for your sister's emotional state that evening, is that correct?" "Of course," Leo said with a magnanimous air. "I love my sister." "So you must have been troubled when she began to cry," Arthur said softly. Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second. "She wasn't crying," he said, a little too quickly. "She was being theatrical." "Theatrical," Arthur repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's interesting, because the housekeeper testified under oath that she heard what she called heartbroken sobbing from the dining room. Perhaps your definitions of theatricality differ." Leo flushed. Arthur moved on, his questions coming faster, circling his prey. "Your father, did he raise his voice to your sister that night?" "No, never," Leo insisted. He was explaining the situation to her. And what was the situation he was explaining? The consequences," Leo stammered, starting to look towards his parents, who sat frozen. "The consequences for what, Mr. Vance?" "The consequences for wanting to honor her grandfather's last wish?" Arthur's voice was like ice. "No, the consequences for not cooperating," Leo snapped, his composure beginning to crack. "For not being a team player." Arthur took a step closer to the witness box. "A team player. I see. And what was the goal of this team?" Leo was sweating now, his eyes darting frantically between Arthur and his father, whose face was a thundercloud. The goal was to protect the company, to do what was right for the family. Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "So, there was a goal. Was there also, Mr. Vance, a plan to achieve that goal?" Panicked, cornered, and utterly out of his depth, Leo blurted out the words that sealed his family's fate. "Yes, the plan we all agreed on to stop her from ruining everything." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Thorne buried his face in his hands. Eleanor let out a tiny, choked sound. Arthur Chen stood back from the witness box, the silence, his exclamation point. "The plan, Mr. Vance?" he asked, his voice ringing with theatrical finality. "Are you referring to the same plan your grandfather described in his diary? The plan to psychologically coerce your sister, to threaten her, to manipulate her until she broke? The plan to get her to sign that document?" Leo stared at him, his mouth agape, the full, catastrophic weight of his admission dawning on him. He had just, under oath, confirmed the existence of the conspiracy. Arthur Chen turned to the judge. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," he said with a slight, ironic bow. No further questions. The courtroom was still reeling from the aftershock of Leo's confession. A chaotic murmur swept through the gallery as Marcus Thorne, his face a grimace of damage control, requested an immediate recess. Leo sat stunned and pale in the witness box, the catastrophic weight of his admission finally crashing down on him. Across the room, Richard and Eleanor Vance were frozen, their expressions identical masks of cold fury directed at their son, the weak link who had just confirmed the conspiracy under oath. For a moment, it seemed the battle was over. Alara had won, but Arthur Chen was not finished. He remained standing, a calm pillar in the swirling chaos, and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "Before we recess, the plaintiff has one final piece of evidence to submit. It does not pertain directly to the contract itself, but it speaks fundamentally to motive. It speaks to the very obsession that drove the defendants to these extreme measures." Thorne was on his feet instantly. "Objection. Irrelevant. Counsel is grandstanding, attempting to further humiliate my clients." The judge looked torn, but Arthur's hook had been perfectly cast. "The court must understand the foundation of this pressure," Arthur pressed. "We must understand why the defendants felt so justified in their actions, why the concept of a male heir was so paramount that they were willing to commit fraud to uphold it." The judge, his curiosity piqued, granted him a narrow leeway. "Proceed, Mr. Chen, but be brief." The room fell silent again, a new, more profound suspense settling over the spectators. What could possibly be more damning than the confession they had just heard? Arthur walked back to his table and retrieved a large, sealed manila envelope, yellowed with age. "I would like to enter into evidence this document, marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit D," he announced. It was recovered from the private safe deposit box of the late William Vance. The contents are certified and have been authenticated by a forensics lab. He called his final witness, a prim, clinical document expert who testified that the envelope contained a certified laboratory report and that the seal, dated nearly 30 years prior, was unbroken. The legal ritual, the formal chain of custody, added a layer of cold procedural dread to the moment. When the expert was dismissed, Arthur Chen, with the judge's permission, placed the contents of the envelope onto the document projector. The entire courtroom leaned forward as one. The image that flickered onto the screen was not a letter or a photograph. It was a sterile, typewritten page filled with scientific jargon and percentages. It was a DNA paternity test. A wave of confusion rippled through the gallery. Arthur Chen walked to the screen, using a pen to point to the relevant lines, his voice as dispassionate as a surgeon's. "This document, commissioned privately by William Vance 29 years ago, lists 3 primary subjects," he began. "Subject A, Eleanor Vance." He paused, letting Eleanor's name sink in. Her face, already pale, became a bloodless mask of terror. Subject B, a newborn male infant, Leo Vance. Leo stared at the screen, his expression one of complete incomprehension. Arthur's pen moved to the final crucial lines. "The test compares the infant's DNA against a reference sample from Richard Vance. Your Honor, I draw your attention to the conclusion at the bottom of the page." He read the words aloud, each one a hammer blow shattering the foundations of the Vance dynasty. "The alleged father, Richard Vance, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Vance. The probability of paternity is 0%. Silence. Absolute. Profound. A silence so complete it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. The reporters in the gallery were frozen, their pens hovering uselessly above their notepads. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible. Leo was just shaking his head slowly, as if trying to refuse a fact his brain could not process. But all eyes were drawn to one man, Richard Vance. He stared at the screen, his face a canvas of slowly dawning horror. He read the words once, then twice. He slowly turned his head and looked at Eleanor, his wife of 3.5 decades, the mother of his children, the partner in his life's ambition. And in that moment, he did not see the woman he knew. He saw a stranger, a ghost who had been living in his house, in his bed, for his entire life. The obsession, the all-consuming, life-defining need to pass the Vance name and the Vance bloodline to a male heir. The pride he felt for his son. The empire he was protecting for his son. The terrible, unforgivable sacrifices he had demanded of his daughter, all for the sake of his son. It was all built on a lie. A lie he had lived and breathed for 30 years. He had not just been deceived in his marriage, he had been deceived in his very purpose. The patriarch who prized lineage above all else had no heir. The man who had just publicly disavowed his true biological child had done so in the name of a son who carried none of his blood. The irony was so immense, so crushing, it was beyond tragedy. It was an annihilation of the soul. The silence was finally broken by a sound, a low, guttural noise of pure agony that was ripped from Richard's throat. He rose slowly from his chair, his body moving with a strange, disconnected stiffness. His eyes, filled with a terrifying, vacant devastation, were locked on Eleanor. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing that carried across the stunned courtroom. "Tell me it's not true." Eleanor could not speak. She simply collapsed in on herself, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs that were a confession more damning than any words. Richard's gaze then shifted from his wife to Leo. He looked at the young man he had called son, the boy he had molded, championed, and chosen. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a vast, horrifying emptiness. And then his head turned and he looked across the aisle at Alara, at his daughter, his brilliant, strong, and defiant daughter who carried his name, his blood, and the spirit of his own father. The daughter he had cast out, humiliated, and tried to destroy. The full, monstrous weight of what he had done, of what he had sacrificed for a lie, landed on him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, collapsing into his chair not as a powerful titan of industry, but as a hollow, broken shell of a man. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge hammered his gavel, shouting for order, but there was no order left to be found. The Vance dynasty, a fortress of power and prestige, had not been defeated. It had been vaporized from the inside out, brought down not by a legal argument, but by the quiet, patient vengeance of a single, long-buried truth. The skeleton had finally been let out of the closet, and it had brought the entire house crashing down with it. The chaos that erupted in the courtroom was merely the public face of a private apocalypse. The House of Vance did not fall, it detonated. Richard, in a state of profound, catatonic shock, was led from the courthouse by paramedics, his eyes vacant, his billion-dollar empire rendered utterly meaningless in the face of a 30-year-old lie. Eleanor, suddenly a pariah, was left utterly alone, a queen whose kingdom, husband, and children had vanished in an instant. And Leo, the boy who was never a king, had fled, a ghost escaping the scene of his own public exorcism. The legal proceedings that followed were a mere formality, a footnote to the human devastation. The judge, having witnessed the spectacular implosion of the defendant's credibility, ruled swiftly. The contract was declared null and void, a product of clear and malicious coercion. Alara Vance was legally reinstated as the owner of 50% of Vance Holdings. It was a victory, but a hollow one. To win a war only to find yourself standing alone on a battlefield of ashes is a victory that feels perilously close to a loss. In the weeks that followed, Alara found herself navigating the wreckage. Vance Holdings was in turmoil, the scandal sending shockwaves through its boardrooms and spooking its investors. She worked tirelessly, not out of ambition, but out of a duty to the one person who had truly believed in her, her grandfather. She was not just salvaging a company, she was preserving his legacy from the ruin his own son had wrought. Richard remained in seclusion, a voluntary prisoner of his own shattered reality, refusing to see or speak to anyone. Eleanor had vanished from the society pages and from life, her whereabouts a mystery. The silence from her family was no longer a punishment, it was a permanent state of being. Then, one afternoon, a plain courier package arrived at her office. It had no return address. Inside, there was no explosive revelation, only a set of sterile legal documents and a single, folded sheet of notepaper. The documents were a stock transfer agreement. With a few spare, elegant strokes of a pen, Leo had signed over his entire 50% share of Vance Holdings to her. She was now the sole owner of the empire. The handwritten note was short, the words of a man who no longer knew who he was. Alara, it read. I can't be the heir to a name that was never really mine. I think it was never about the money, for either of us. It was about who we were supposed to be. That person, for me, doesn't exist. It's all yours now. It probably always should have been. Don't try to find me. He had abdicated. The crown prince, discovering he was an imposter, had simply walked away from the throne and from the world, leaving her in sole possession of a kingdom she had never wanted. That evening, Alara stood in the vast corner office on the top floor of the Vance Tower. It had been her grandfather's office, then her father's, and now, impossibly, it was hers. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of New York City glittered below, a galaxy of ambition and dreams. She had won. She had everything, and she had nothing. She had the power, the fortune, and the name. But the family she had once, however painfully, belonged to, was gone. And in the quiet hum of the empty office, she finally understood the profound truth of her journey. She had not fought to reclaim her family. She had fought to free herself from the beautiful, suffocating illusion of it. The family she had yearned for, the one built on unconditional love and mutual respect, had never truly existed outside of her own heart. Justice, she discovered, is not a balm that heals all wounds. Sometimes, it is merely a mirror that forces you to see the truth of your scars and to finally accept that you are the one who must heal them. They had tried to bury her. They had covered her in the darkness of their lies, in the suffocating soil of tradition and expectation, believing she would simply disappear, but they never understood the nature of their own child. They didn't know that she was a seed, drawing strength from the very pressure that was meant to crush her, pushing relentlessly upward toward a single sliver of light. The story of the Vance family, now etched into the city's lore, stands as a monument of glass and steel, a testament to a simple, terrifying truth. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For when they finally choose to speak, their voice will not be a plea for mercy, it will be a verdict. Thank you for listening.